Welcome to all of you. We are so pleased that you can join us here this evening. On behalf of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, which serves the University of Pennsylvania, I would like to thank you for joining us for our evening conversation, Writing Between Cultures, exploring the Catholicism of Endo, Greene, McKay, and Su. I would also like to take a moment to thank our wonderful co-sponsors, many of whom are responsible for your presence with us here tonight. Our special thanks goes to Image Journal, Dappled Things Magazine, Ecstasis Magazine, the Genealogies of Modernity Project, the St. Thomas Catholic Studies Graduate Program, Villanova Department of Humanities, Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture at the University of Dallas, Georgetown Department of English, the Beatrice Institute, the Portsmouth Institute, as well as Penn's English Department and Penn's Comparative Literature Department. Thank you to all of you. My name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm the director of our Ars Vivendi Arts Initiative. So the aim of this initiative is to create a conversational space to explore the relationships between beauty, faith, and the arts, probing their importance to human culture and to a life well lived. Some of the questions we explore are things like, what effect does beauty have on the human soul? Why do we seek it, and does it seek us? What does artistic creation entail? Ultimately, the Ars Vivendi Arts Initiative seeks to integrate artistic craft with an understanding of aesthetics and an appreciation for the intellectual life behind the creative mind. This initiative includes student programming, a new partnership with Dappled Things, which is a quarterly magazine of ideas, art, and faith founded by Penn alumni, seminars, and special events like this one tonight, with plans for fellowship opportunities, cultural productions, artist workshops, and artist retreats. Tonight's event is a chance to delve into this creative space, to explore the life and work of creative minds. To do so, I'll hand things off to Collegium's theologian in residence, Terrence Sweeney.
Good evening. Our state in life, according to the Irish philosopher William Desmond, is to be between. We live within this between as we move towards a beyond that beckons to each of us. Each of the writers we'll be discussing tonight have more intensely lived this between, because they have lived between cultures and written about the experience of life between cultures. They lived an itinerary that marked their own writing as they wrestled with the task of being Catholic in their diverse cultures. Shūsaku Endō felt the deep experience of Christianity as alien to the soil of Japan, as he himself traveled routes between Japan and Europe, between health and sickness, like his characters in Stained Glass Elegies and The Samurai. Claude McKay, Jamaican-born, proud denizen of Harlem, expat in Europe, dreaming of Africa. Faced with the deep racism of America and also of the Communist Party, he was like La Fala in his Romance in Marseille, a stowaway between America, France, and Africa, in a sense, legless on his journey home. Greene, a Catholic in a less than friendly England, traveled throughout the world, a restless heart, who walked the lawless roads of Mexico and saw the alienation of Catholicism that so marks the power and the glory. And Su Xuelin, whose travels to France inspired her as yet untranslated masterpiece, Thorny Heart, as she encountered the possibility of a revolution of the heart. Zhu journeyed a route to Catholicism that eventually meant she could no longer travel in her mainland China. What these novelists show is that our journeys between can become pilgrimages as we navigate the complexities of culture, racial discrimination, and colonization, and as we do so sustained by our hope and our faith, and perhaps too by the power of stories and poetry. Tonight is my honor to introduce 4 scholars as they help us navigate these Catholic writers as they navigate between in a way that I hope will deepen all of our pilgrimages. Mark Bosco of the Society of Jesus is the vice president for mission and ministry at Georgetown University and teaches in the English and theology departments. His research focuses on the theological aesthetics and the intersection of religion and art, especially in the Catholic literary tradition. He is the author of Greene's Catholic Imagination, Revelation and Convergence, Flannery O'Connor and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, and Reading Flannery O'Connor in Spain. He's also written on the novelist Shūsaku Endō and is the co-producer and co-director of the documentary film on the writer Flannery O'Connor, which won the Library of Congress and Ken Burns Prize for Best Film in 2019 and will be nationally broadcast on PBS American Masters in early 2021. Cecilia A. Moore graduated from Sweetbriar College with an AB in History and Religion, and from the University of Virginia with a PhD in American Religious History. She has taught at the University of Dayton in the Department of Religious Studies since 1996, and at Xavier University of Louisiana's Institute for Black Catholic Studies since 1998. Her area of specialization is U.S. Catholic history with a focus on the Black Catholic experience. She has written for numerous scholarly and popular journals. With Dr. C. Vanessa White and the late Father Paul Marshall, she co-edited Songs of Our Hearts and Meditations of Our Souls, Prayers for Black Catholics. Her research on Claude McKay is related to her work on the history of Black Catholic converts in the 20th century. Nick Rapachizone is the culture editor of Image Journal, a magazine that considers the relationship among art, literature, and religion. He writes widely on books, film, culture, God, and sports for publications such as The Atlantic, The Paris Review, America Magazine, and others. He has written multiple books, including Longing for an Absent God, Ember Days, This Darksome Burn, and The Fine Delight. And, as far as I can tell from following him on Twitter, is nearing completion of his forthcoming book, Wild Belief, Poets and Prophets in the Wilderness. Stephanie Wong is a professor at Valparaiso University's Theology Department and teaches global Christianity and Asian religions. She researches the development of Catholic theology in China, especially in dialogue with Confucianism and Buddhism. Professor Wong's primary research area is Chinese Christianity. She studies the socio-historical experience of Christians in China, especially that of indigenous Chinese Christians. At the same time, she explores the contours of constructive theology today, the ongoing effort to discern God's invitations to enculturate or incarnate Christian theology in terms of the philosophical heritage and social realities of life in China. I look forward to our discussions tonight, and I'm happy to introduce Father Mark Bosco, our first speaker.
Thank you, Terrence. And it's really a pleasure to be with everybody here at Collegium, and a pleasure to be with Cecilia, Stephanie, and Nick in this wonderfully titled panel on writing between cultures. I say that because I'm very interested myself in the way that this Catholic aesthetic, this literary aesthetic, this artistic kind of encounter or engagement, in many ways can be traced as a kind of a global transnational movement. You might say that in the 20th century, at least, it was Dostoevsky landing in the intellectual life of Catholics in France, trying to figure out how to be Catholic and modern at the same time, with Bernanos and Mauriac and Blois and so many others. And then kind of migrating across the waters to England 20 or 30 years later, to Great Britain with Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and Muriel Spark, taking an airplane to the United States with the kind of Renaissance going on in the 50s and 60s between Thomas Merton and Flannery O'Connor. But in the midst of that, you have Shūsaku Endō, who I'm going to talk about tonight, who in some ways, there is no Catholic Shūsaku Endō without that sense that he was part of a narrative, part of an aesthetic theological imagination that he needed to grapple with. And it happened mostly in his time in France, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So what I want to say basically is that I believe that the aesthetics of Catholicism, its theological underpinnings, as well as the way that we dramatize some of the issues in a very modern way in the last, say, 100 years, is absolutely essential in how we talk about these artists. Endo is if you go to the archives of Greene in Boston College, there's a wonderful letter that of Endo writing Greene, and Greene saying, your book Silence was so much better than my book The Power and the Glory, which I think we can contest that, but I do think it's very interesting that they're already talking and communicating. Matter of fact, Shūsaku Endō's wife said, there would be no Endo writing if it hadn't been for his being inspired by those like Graham Greene. I think it's important to remember, though, that Endo, Japan is, it's not a Catholic country. Obviously, it's got this history of Catholic persecution that comes out, of course, in Silence most vividly in that story or in that film by Scorsese. But there was this kind of small Catholic community when Endo was in college, and he went to a small little kind of Catholic dormitory, whose dorm master had studied with Jacques Maritain in Paris. So this idea that somehow France and a French Catholic kind of aesthetic was so important to Endo's formation and shape. And so he's dealing with both its European Catholicism and his own culture. So he admires Greene, he admires Bernanos, he admires Mauriac. He wants to write his thesis while he's in Lyon in 1950 on them. He gets tuberculosis, and he feels like an outsider both in Paris or France and Lyon for being kind of the Japanese individual, the side that lost the war in World War II, and that his Catholicism didn't make him feel like he fit in even there because of his Japanese identity. And so, of course, being in Japan, he always felt being marginalized and feeling the other because Catholicism was such a limited population of people. So what does he learn, and what becomes the kind of the trace, you might say, the DNA of a Catholic literary aesthetic that he's going to grapple with? What the French, I think, did through Dostoevsky and through so many others was kind of get to these key kind of elements. And the first one is that wonderful line from Charles Péguy, that the sinner is at the heart of Christianity, that the story, the modern story of faith is about looking at sinners and their salvation, their dramas, not of good people, not of saved people, but those who are kind of in between, those people who are on the edge, those who are in places of transgression. So this is obviously what the French write. This is what Graham Greene writes about. Endo is going to pick this up, and he's going to use that kind of moment as well. Certainly existential kind of spiritual hounding. The characters in all of the French, British, and American, there's a sense that, I think Flannery O'Connor, Hazel Mote's being hounded by this god. Graham Greene's whiskey priest being hounded by this god. Well, in some ways, if you read through Shūsaku Endō's Catholicism, there is a sense that he can't quite take off. He talks about that ill-fitting suit. He can't quite take off the suit of this faith, this Catholic faith. But he feels like there's something kind of that he has to grapple with, a hounding, that somehow he has to deal with the darkness and the imperfections of one's life. And so his characters are often these very, again, mixed bags of people with good intentions, but these moments of pride, vanity, and confusion in the cultural world. And I also think that what we learn in this kind of aesthetic is a kind of clash between what you might call the bourgeois formalities of faith and beliefs, very countercultural commitments. And so there's this sense of not fitting in, of trying to deepen the complexities of what is maybe a superficial religion or superficial kind of devotion, kind of getting in between those things, a clash between that there's something more than a kind of commodified, commercialized religion. But finally, and I think this is most important to how Endo tries to deal with his Japanese self and his Christian or Catholic self, and it's this idea of kenosis, this theological word, this Greek word of self-emptying, kind of a self-emptying gesture. Sometimes it's kind of, I think, overly played as this kind of a spiritual selflessness, an emptying of the self where there's nothing there. Of course, for the Catholic theological imagination, kenosis is generative, right? I give myself over to something, and in giving myself over to it, of emptying myself of my pride or of my talent or my gifts, whatever it might be, something has generated. And that generation, of course, is that I participate in the life of Christ. So we have this kind of suffering servant kind of kenosis. We have, of course, Christ as kenosis. And we have these characters who are they would give up their lives for the sake of something greater. It seems to me that what Endo has tried to do is, in all of his stories, but certainly if you take Silence and Deep River, the two kind of the bookends of his work, certainly the samurai's in there as well, there is this kind of negotiation of these four things, a kind of a sense of how do I wrestle with Christianity in a Japanese context? I'm going to do it by using the drama, the dramatic ways in which Christianity has been kind of reimagined as a modernist kind of moment. How do we be modern in the 20th century? So just looking at my time, doing okay, I think. I think Endo's Catholicism then is kind of offered him a discourse on how to think about religious pluralism. He's not, in Silence, as he looks at these historical markers, this is again done early, the 1960s. It's done, Vatican II has not kind of even taken hold, it was just ending. And there was a sense of him just trying to figure out, how can one have interreligious dialogue? How can two religious cultures penetrate one another? How can you have one or two identities? I think that's what he's doing in all of his stories. And I think all of his stories have this lifelong journey to explore what he calls the confrontation of his Catholic self with what is that self underneath. I think it comes to fruition in Deep River. A lot of folks think that Endo's so transgressive with some of these doctrinal moments or these kinds of assumptions that he's lost his faith. I'm not quite sure where they get that. If in close readings, show an author, an artist whose imagination is fully engaged with the intellectual life of his faith, feeling its difference and feeling its complexities. So I think to sum up, because I know I am running out of time now, I think when you look at Endo and the way that, this kind of cross-cultural, he goes to France, he learns something, he studies it, he's going to write his thesis on this kind of French Catholic way of being modern, that Catholicism is a way to be modern. And he tries to appropriate that and tries to get on the inside of that from a Japanese perspective. So much so that I think that Endo, as a good Catholic, you might say, is not looking for some kind of philosophical or theological stance that kind of transcends the East and the West. But I think he's trying to suggest an encounter with each tradition kind of penetrating the mystery of the other, a kind of looking for the spiritual analogies of kenosis played out in his stories, of a way of a gesture of humility in the face of that. So I think with that in mind, you can say that kenosis, a sense of the sinner at the heart of Christianity, an encounter with the person of Christ, the encounter with an insight about this Christian moment is always present in his novels. So I'll stop with that. I think I'm done. And so read a lot of Endo. I'm going to now introduce for us, I think, Celia Moore, right? So Celia, take it away.
Good evening. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. I want to start with a poem by Claude McKay. When I have passed away and am forgotten, and no one living can recall my face, when under alien soil soil my bones lie rotten, with not a tree or stone to mark the place. Perchance a pensive youth with passion burning, for olden verse that smacks of love and wine, must pages of old volumes turning, may light upon a little song of mine. And may he softly hum the tune and wonder who wrote the verses of long ago. Or may he sit him down a while to ponder upon the simple words that touched him so. I want to thank you for including Claude McKay in this conversation tonight and remembering him as a Catholic author. We already have heard that he was born and raised in Jamaica, and that he was one of the most important artists of the Harlem Renaissance. He was also a very controversial figure in African American arts and letters. In 1920, he made what was called the magical pilgrimage to Moscow, and he spent a couple of years there writing, speaking, and promoting the cause of communism, advocating it as a vital ally for Black people throughout the world. By the end of that, by the end of his time there, however, he was renouncing Marxism and charging that communists never intended to treat Blacks as their equals. He came to believe that he had been cruelly exploited, and he spent the rest of his life as an ardent anti-communist and a promoter of Black self-reliance. He entered into communion with the Catholic Church in 1944 when he was baptized by the auxiliary bishop of Chicago, Bernard J. Shiel. Friendship House disciples Ellen Terry and Mary Jurdo Keating were instrumental in his conversion. They and other Friendship House volunteers nursed McKay back to health in 1943. And when he got well enough to leave the city, Keating offered a cottage to McKay for him to convalesce at. She also introduced him to Bishop Shiel, who hired McKay to be his advisor on Russian and Negro affairs. And he welcomed that new career. It gave him the opportunity to join forces with the Catholic Church in combating communism in the Black community. According to his biographer, Wayne Cooper, that first year in Chicago working with Bishop Shiel was Claude McKay's happiest year in his entire life. He lectured on Black culture in Chicago and throughout the Midwest, and he made friends with and participated in the Chicago Friendship House. He regularly briefed Bishop Shiel on Russian communism, race relations, and world affairs, as well as summarized articles on those topics for him. But probably most importantly, this is when he started to write poetry again in earnest, and with the encouragement and really, quite frankly, the legwork of his friend from long before he became a Catholic, Dorothy Day. He began to publish those poems in the Catholic Worker, and she also sent him to other Catholic publications that might be interested in his poems. Now, long before his conversion, he was friends with both Ellen Terry, who I've already mentioned, and Dorothy Day. And Day and Terry shared a lot in common. They were converts, they were journalists, they were book authors, and they were strong women who could really stand up and argue with Claude McKay, who loved to argue. Terry learned about McKay, of course, long before she ever met him. She loved his poetry, but she hated his novel Home to Harlem. And she wrote about that. She accused him of selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. She said it was gross and debased. It exaggerated Black life in Harlem. And she wasn't alone in that criticism. W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey also criticized it along the same lines. Now, 10 years later, in 1938, they would meet, and that's when they would really form their friendship. He introduced her to many of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance and welcomed her into the Negro Writers Guild. They argued a lot about religion. She was a convert to Catholicism herself, and she challenged him. She said, you should become a Catholic because you're a man of the world and you love justice, and Catholicism is the universal religion and it definitely pursues justice. He said, I'm an intellectual, and it's easier if you're an intellectual not to believe than to believe. But she kept on prodding him, and he said she made him do, quote, hard thinking that made him reevaluate his beliefs about Catholicism. He also said she helped him to see that Black people had a long history in the church going back to the very beginning, that it was a religion that asserted the dignity of every person, and that there were lots of Black people in the United States as well as around the globe who were Catholic. These investigations, these things that she was telling him caused him to do his own investigation, and he said that in that investigation, he became flooded with the true light, and he came to see that Catholicism wasn't what he thought it was. So she is, I think, a really important person in the conversion of Claude McKay, and that conversion would lead him into writing this poetry after he became a Catholic. Dorothy Day, I also think is important to have an understanding of the relationship between Dorothy Day and Claude McKay, because again, she helps him very much by publishing his poems in the Catholic Worker after he becomes a Catholic. But they had known each other before. They were friends in New York City during their radical years. They were also both friends with Max Eastman and wrote for The Liberator. And when he became a Catholic, they renewed their friendship through letters. And they argued too. They argued about communism. He didn't think she had condemned it enough. And she said, you have to realize that communists can be redeemed too. So they would argue about that. They also talked about their vocations, hers at the Catholic Worker, welcoming the poorest Christ. And he seeing that his vocation was writing. They also shared their suffering. At the time, they were both really lamenting their relationships with their daughters. They were heartsick, actually, about these relationships at the time that they renewed their friendship. Dorothy and her daughter Tamar were estranged, but Claude McKay had never met his daughter. He left his wife before he met his daughter. And in those letters, they share their regrets about things that they wish they had done differently as parents. These two, who had been friends in their young radical days, now in their middle years, were reunited because they were living a new way of life, and that was the Catholic way of life. Those are really beautiful letters, and they're in the Yale Library. Now, meeting his daughter was something he really wanted to do. He was not able to do it. And when so that fell to Ellen Terry. Also, his funeral fell to her. And she says that she paints a very lovely picture of that funeral, in which he had a requiem mass said in Chicago by Bishop Shield, and his body was sent to New York. And he got there late. His remains arrived late, 4 hours after the mass had been said in absentia. But when his body finally arrived, Ellen Terry and the other Friendship House disciples and Catholic workers, they gathered around his casket and prayed the rosary for him. And Ellen Terry said that she was comforted to know that the bitter and angry Claude McKay of the past years was at peace when God called him home to that part of heaven where weary, battle-scarred writers go. He had peace and comfort in the Catholic Church in his last years, and that was important because he lived with a great deal of pain, debilitating pain. But he also had a renewed sense of hope and promise in his vocation as an artist. The Catholic Church gave him a way to serve. He could use his gifts to serve. And the poetry he wrote in that period intrigued, challenged, and inspired. And it also added new color to this ever unfolding Catholic story. I'd like to pass this off now to Nick. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We're discussing a topic that I've found most important, how the varied representations of Catholicism in a diverse set of literature can illuminate the beauty and the conflicts within the religion and within the faith. So I'll be speaking about Graham Greene. In February 1925, as a 20-year-old undergraduate at Oxford, Graham Greene wrote his first film review for the Oxford Outlook. And early in the review, there is a line: "We either go to church and worship the Virgin Mary, or to a public house and snigger over stories and limericks." Now, Greene had been raised in the Anglican faith of his parents, but he was not a believer. Vivian Dayrell Browning, the secretary for the publisher of some of Greene's poems, shortly after the review wrote him a letter and corrected him that Catholics venerate rather than worship Mary. So Greene later reflected on that experience, saying that he was interested that anyone took what he called the subtle distinctions of an unbelievable theology seriously. A year after that correction, Greene had converted to Catholicism, which started a lifelong engagement with Catholic faith and doubt. So I've always been drawn to that anecdote for two reasons. Immigrant Catholic families like mine have a particular devotion to Mary. It's an iconographic devotion through candles and statues and rosaries. Mary is ever present and complex. She remains a conundrum of sorts. She's a source of vulnerability and humility and surprising power. So Greene's mistake is a common one for non-Catholics, but it is telling that his first significant intersection with Catholicism rests upon a mistake of theology. His Marian ignorance was essentially a clash of cultures. So 10 years later, Greene traveled to Mexico to write about what he called, quote, the fiercest persecution of religion anywhere since the reign of Elizabeth. The Lawless Roads, his book of nonfiction, tells the story of closed churches, secret mass, outlawed sacraments, and priests put in prison or executed. He documents the anti-Catholic presidency of Plutarco Elias Calles, and one of his successors was Lázaro Cárdenas, who wasn't a friend of the church either, but his anti-Catholic rhetoric and rules were more regional than national. So Greene soon travels to Tabasco, where he describes the place as an isolated, swampy, puritanical state. And the region's governor, Tomás Garrido Canabal, had eradicated Catholicism. Every priest was hunted down or shot, Greene wrote, except one, who existed for 10 years in the forests and swamps, venturing out only at night. His few letters, Greene writes, recorded an awful sense of impotence, to live in constant danger and be able to do so little, it hardly seemed worth the horror. Now, those who have read The Power and the Glory will probably recognize that that was the inspiration for the Whiskey Priest. But when Greene is in Mexico, Tabasco seems even worse when he is present. There's the melancholy remains of a vanquished faith. He says there were no secret masses in private houses, such as were found in the neighboring state, only a dreadful lethargy, as the Catholics had died slowly out. Without confession, without sacraments, the child unbaptized, the dying man unshriven. Elsewhere in Mexico, Catholicism is pushed to the margins, as in what Greene encounters in Las Casas, where he found a grove of tall black crosses that stood at all angles like wind-blown trees against the blackened sky. He describes his perception of indigenous people's brand of faith as a, quote, dark, tormented magic cult. And as with other moments of Greene's, there is a whiff of residual colonialism in that description, but he asserts that Catholicism is inherently magic. The man raised from the dead, the devils cast out, the water turned into wine. So there's a great description of Catholicism as the one populist shield against secular modernity. Greene writes, the great crosses lean there in their black and windy solitude, safe from the pistoleros and the politicians and one thought of the spittle mixed with the clay to heal the blind man, the resurrection of the body, and the religion of the earth. Now we might contrast that description with how Graham Greene felt when he went back to England. He described Mass in Chelsea as, quote, curiously fictitious. No peon knelt with his arms out in the attitude of the cross. No woman dragged herself up the aisle on her knees. Greene wrote, it would have seemed shocking, like the agony itself. We do not mortify ourselves, and perhaps we are in need of violence. So Mexico had a strong mark on Greene. In fact, so strong that it became the material of what I would consider to be perhaps his best novel, The Power and the Glory. So the book's hero is an unnamed priest on the run from Mexican authorities after a state general or a state governor has ordered the military to dismantle all vestiges of the religion. So that's the lawless roads priest that I referenced before. In Greene's novel, churches are burned, relics, medals, and crosses are banned. The price for disobedience is death. While many of the clerics give up their beliefs and accept their government pensions, the unnamed priest travels in secret, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions under the cover of night. He's also gluttonous, stubborn, and angry. He's a man drowning in his vices, and the religious ambition of his younger years has been replaced with a constant desire to drink. Hence Greene's term for him, the whiskey priest. Tired of risking his life, the priest even prays to be caught. In Life and in Fiction, Greene was far more interested in sinners than he was in saints. And the whiskey priest is no saint, at least not for most of the story. If anything, he's closer to the modern conception of the anti-hero. His pride swells his sense of importance. In one village where the faithful fear retribution for the military officers, the priest hesitates to leave. Greene writes, wasn't it his duty to stay, even if they despised him, even if they were murdered for his sake, and even if they were corrupted by his example? Later in the novel, he's selfish, crude, and heretical in one stroke. He eats a sugar cube that he discovered by a dead child's mouth and rationalizes, if God chose to give back life, couldn't he give food as well? In these and countless other examples, Greene shows how easily dogma can disappear in the face of desperation. But beneath the darkness of the priest's actions, I do think is a faith, which he bears witness to in two pivotal scenes. He's arrested for possessing outlawed alcohol, and he's thrown into a small jail cell with a, quote, pious woman who later notices a couple together in the corner of the cell. The brutes, the animals, she says, but the priest counsels the woman to not think that their action is ugly. The priest says, because suddenly we discover that our sins have so much beauty. The priest explains, saints talk about the beauty of suffering. We are not saints, you and I. Suffering to us is just ugly stench and crowding and pain that is beautiful in that corner to them. Greene's aversion to sentimentality makes for palpable theology. He finds God in dirt and in blood, in the Christian struggle to make faith matter in life. So the priest asks the woman to pray for him. And she responds, the sooner you are dead, the better. And he thinks about how he can't see her face in the dark and uses that temporary blindness as a metaphor for judgment and understanding. He says, when you saw the lines at the corners of the eyes, the shape of the mouth, how the hair grew. It was impossible to hate. Hate was just a failure of imagination. Greene's novel examines what happens when an unfit believer is made responsible for the well-being of an entire community. Because the government has destroyed the physical artifacts of Catholicism, the priest must turn inward and confront his own doubts. And as the only remaining face of the church, he's forced to air his private demons. But rather than reveling in those sins, he is crushed by their significance, and he seeks to replace greed with grace. It was too easy to die for what was good or beautiful, the priest reflects before the novel's tragic end. The world needed a God to die for the half-hearted and the corrupt. So it's the novel's empathy for that half-hearted and corrupt, and its recognition that even those people are worthy of salvation that makes the story especially powerful. And I think that The Power and the Glory serves as a testament that it is often the Catholics who are on the margins, like the indigenous people in Mexico, who are most Christ-like in their subversion of power. Now it is my great pleasure to pass the Zoom screen on to Stephanie Wong.
Hello there. I'm presenting today on the Chinese Catholic writer and literary scholar Su Xuelin, a complicated figure whose mixed legacy reflects what I'm calling the polemical packaging of modernity. And I say packaging because, like so many, in so many places, I'm sharing my screen here for you, the modernity was not merely the fact of contemporary life, but was also a constructive project to identify elements of thought and of action that would be useful for the life of China and its people. And I say polemical because such a construction of modernity inevitably raised bitter battles over what should be in or out of that package in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Could modernity include Confucian values, the liberation of women, Western models of constitutional governance, Chinese traditional warfare, social Darwinism, and of course, for what we're interested in, religion? And if so, which religions? Chinese traditional religions or religions understood to come from the West, like Catholicism? I'll say out the gate that Su Xuelin is most known and most controversial for participating in one of the uglier battles, one of the uglier fights of Chinese intellectual history. In the last part of her life, she waged a decades-long ad hominem war against one of the other writers of her time, Lu Xun, trying to undercut his writing and his character. She was a strident anti-communist, and he had been the cultural icon of the leftist Writers Guild in China. And after his death, as he was lionized as the hero of social realism by the Communist Party, Su Xuelin spent basically the second half of her life trying to undermine his writing and his character. And so if she's known at all in China today, it tends to be along the lines of that crazy lady who went after Lu Xun, because it seems like such a radical and professionally suicidal thing to have done. Nonetheless, I want to focus today on the earlier part of her life and her literary work, and the context that I think highlights for us well the complicated layers of gender and also religion, Catholicism, that made literature such a flashpoint for ideological conflict. And if there's anything to understand about Su Xuelin and the writers of her time, it's that literature was high stakes during their lives. Literature in early 20th century China was a venue for airing thoughts about society and the future of China. And it was also became a litmus test for one's political stance, what language you used and what genres you took up. So a bit of background. Su Xuelin was born in 1897, in the last faltering years of the Qing dynasty, to a family of scholar officials. But it was a family ruled by her deeply traditional and often oppressive grandmother, who insisted on binding the girls' feet and was utterly opposed to letting them have an education. And she was a teenager when the Xinhai Revolution brought down the Qing dynasty. And the new Republic of China established a system of public education. Su Xuelin actually threatened to commit suicide if she was not going to be allowed to go to school. So she was able to attend the Anhui Provincial School in her area, and then, with the help of her mother, who advocated for her, to go off to Beijing to study at the normal college there. And that was a wonderful opportunity for her because she had a chance to study under the famous pragmatist philosopher and the new culture essayist, Hu Shi. So let me explain what new culture refers to. Going to Beijing put Su at the center of some of China's most fervent debates over how to renovate the nation for the sake of a new China. In the 1910s, the New Culture movement was a wide-reaching scholarly effort to try to both assess and improve Chinese culture. Many intellectuals felt that China had faltered in the last decades of the Qing dynasty and become weak against the Western powers and in war against Japan because of a kind of internal weakness in the Chinese government and in the Chinese mentality itself. And so there was great interest in the 1910s in adopting concepts like science and democracy from the West and seeing how they might be useful in strengthening China. And I'll talk about this a little further. One of the key components of this new culture movement was the effort to reform Chinese literature. After 1919, the movement takes a more populist and explicitly anti-foreign element, as Chinese university students hope to bring about new China and reject all that was foreign and also all that was traditional. Like Shūsaku Endō, Su Xuelin went to France for a time. And so it was in France where she went to study literature and painting that in 1924 she converts to Catholicism. And this was a very unpopular choice because most of the Chinese students who had gone to Western Europe had gone sponsored by the government in order to study socialist thought and also anarchist thought. So for her to convert to Roman Catholicism in France was an odd and unpopular choice among the Chinese expat students there. Nonetheless, she writes in some of her later essays about how taken she was with the humble kindness of the French that she encountered there, and also the idea of a transcendent God that gave them a sense of purpose. But she returns to China not long after, pressured by her family, she felt, to join into an arranged marriage with an engineer. They had a very unhappy marriage that they only lived together a few years. They never divorced, but they never lived together after about 4 years. And then the last part of her life, and this is when she establishes herself as a scholar, is in the 1930s. Long before Wuhan became known for the coronavirus, it was a wonderful center of literary fervor. And so she taught throughout the 1930s at National Wuhan University, and especially enjoyed a tight circle of women writers who studied in the humanities. And there at Wuhan, Su Xuelin is credited with essentially founding the discipline of modern Chinese literature and building coursework in studying literature, the history of it, and the new formulations of it in modern China. And then it was in this decade here that she begins to attack Lu Xun in the midst of tensions between the communists and nationalists, and as attacks from Japan are becoming stronger. After the communists established the People's Republic, she then spends the rest of her life in other places, France, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So I just want to briefly note some of the stakes in what she did. At this point in China, as I said, language itself was such a controversial issue because part of the hope of the Chinese reformers and the New Culture movement was to bring about a new language, to renovate the language itself. And so whereas previous literature had always been written in classical Chinese, Su and others began to shift into writing in vernacular Chinese for the very first time in Chinese history. You have Bai Huayan, which is the vernacular Chinese. And they were also experimenting with different genres. So this is one of the transnational elements of our topic, that many writers like Su and others are translating novels from the West, from France and England and other countries, interested in the genre of the novel because they see it as useful for the political project of becoming a strong nation. But Su Xuelin in particular focused on literary prose and wrote a number of personal and familiar writings that were not necessarily so geared at pushing the kind of national vision and critiquing the former weakness of China, but were simply meant to evoke the experience of the person. And then she writes fiction. And I think the closest genre category to the word novel in Chinese would be xiaoshuo, which is inherited from the Western genre of a novel and kind of brought back into the Chinese context, where writers now begin to think of themselves as having a literature, participating in something like a global literature where there might be a Chinese case under that umbrella. This quote just says a little bit about the ambitions for this new fiction. Liang Qichao, one of the visionaries of the New Republic, says, "If one intends to renovate the people of a nation, one cannot but first renovate its fiction. Therefore, to renovate morality, one must renovate fiction. To renovate religion, one must renovate fiction." You get the point. One of the great tensions between Su Xuelin and some of her friends and rivals in the literary community was over the purpose and the content of literature. Was the purpose of literature to be didactic, to teach the way? 在道 literally means literature that kind of carries the teaching or the way, or was it meant to be expressive? And whereas Lu Xun fell squarely on the side of a didactic literature for the nation, Su Xuelin typically preferred more expressive modes of writing that gave voice to her experience. So here I have just a screenshot of one of her texts, In My Moments of Dejection, where she goes through this kind of stream of consciousness writing about pairs and what the pairs mean to her, and then describes how one of her childhood acquaintances, a maid, was very done wrong by the family, was essentially destroyed by the cruelty of her aunt. And you can see how Su Xuelin uses the familiarity and informality of this new style of writing to communicate the experience of women that she thinks are largely being ignored by the more ardent and pragmatic nationalists like Lu Xun. Let me just, and then she also is taking a stance on content. And so her most famous novel, called Thorny Heart, is essentially a post-secular narrative of conversion that tells, it tells the story of a young woman whose life experience echoes her. It's a young woman who goes to France to study, and then is surprised by the faith and the religion of the Catholics in France, and sees how faith might be a kind of solution to the social alienation that modernity and the quest for a strong nation seems to have brought to the scholarly elites. So the protagonist in this novel, Thorny Heart, begins to wonder, is the desire for studying in fact an act of self-gift for the collective, for China back home, or is it an exercise in individualistic self-development? She says to save China and to promote science are, as a matter of course, urgent tasks, but it is first necessary to strive for the transformation of the spirit. To strive for the transformation of the spirit, it is first necessary to break through the traditional selfish outlook and attend to moral life. And you see here how Su Xuelin, through this protagonist, begins to wonder if the problems that have beset China are not only problems of governmental weakness and of foreign oppression, but also human problems of selfishness and of sin. So in conclusion, I just want to note that Su Xuelin packages modernity in a way differently than most of the male new culture writers who are very intent on using the new informal language and using new genres in order to try to renovate the culture for the purposes of the nation, for the purposes of the state. And I think perhaps it's because of her experience as a woman who was very much clawing her way, working very hard to find a place in the literary scene at all, that she's not too keen on any project that's going to sublimate the expression of the individual so quickly to nationhood. She wants to retain that space for expression, to give rise to the thoughts, the unpredictable thoughts, the perhaps religious thoughts of the individual before the totalizing vision of the state will subsume all interests such as those. So I'll leave it there, and we'll turn it now to the rest of the group to talk.
So thank you to all our panelists. What we're going to do now is I'll have some questions for each of our panelists as their screens click on. And then for all of our attendees, you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen there's a little thing that says Q&A. If you'd like to start entering any questions you may have, we'll try to get to some of them near the end. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A column there at the bottom. So I have some questions, and really these questions are, can be fielded by each one of you, or just one of you, or whoever wants to jump in. So, and I recognize, of course, it's hard to sometimes think on the spot, but I'm coming for you. So one thing that struck me really about each writer here tonight is kind of a sense of being an outsider, some amount of alienation, and I wonder in what ways does being an outsider kind of both provide an inspiration for their writing, but also provide a kind of guide for their sense of how to be Catholic in the modern world.
Well, I didn't want to go first on this one, but I will. I do think you're absolutely right. There is this sense of being othered, of a kind of writers, I think, feeling their own difference, and then seeing in Catholicism a way that as a faith, as it's the unreformed faith, it's the primitive faith, it's the faith of old, it's not the new, and it gives you a place to kind of land in your creative imagination, I think, and it allows you to reassess, I think, how you understand such things as community and loyalty and love, betrayal. It gives you another place to stand, I think, and that place is a lonely place because faith is usually considered kind of a part of a cultural's, the cultural assumptions are kind of complacent, comfortable, kind of, ritual, perhaps superficial. And all these writers find in a kind of, in these marginalized spaces, a way to think about what does it mean to be a human being? What are the adequate kind of contours of that? So, and certainly different cultures allow that even more strikingly.
Something that also that came out in the talks tonight is this idea, of course, themes for tonight being between cultures, but also, of course, being between cultures can lend itself to an experience of clashing, right? The clashing of cultures. And I think we can see, some level of that experience in each one. And I mean, even in Claude McKay's kind of clash of counters that ultimately develops between himself and communism. And I wonder, in that sense, is there a way in which how do these writers speak to this kind of avoiding clashes between cultures, or sometimes maybe speak to the need for a clash? And then maybe also, how does their Catholicism help bridge some of this clashing of cultures?
Well, I think in the case of Claude McKay, when he was done with something, he was really done with it. And I think that the stance that the Catholic Church had taken on communism, and his ability to see that that the Catholic Church wasn't just saying that communism is bad and you should have nothing to do with it. Friendship House was actually founded by a Russian immigrant, the Baroness Catherine de Hewick, and she didn't like communism either, but she said, you should not throw communism away because it's got a lot of things that are very positive that could be used to bring people to the church. And one of the things that Catholics in the United States were so afraid of in that time was that that the communists were making too great of inroad in the Black community. Because communists had come in to fill voids that other Americans, the government and churches and all sorts of other things in our country had left voids and really, had turned their backs on Black people. And communists had stepped in. And one of the things that she felt was that the Catholic Church should step in too. And I think that McKay liked that aspect, that it wasn't enough to just condemn something. He had already condemned it, but there needed to be something in its place. And these women, because Friendship House, the disciples of Friendship House are principally women, and they really just they pitched in, they took care of him, they rescued him, and that meant a lot to him. That meant a lot to him because he had burned so many bridges. And I think probably he thought he had burned his bridges with Ellen Terry, but she just never threw them away. And that is something that I noticed when I was doing the research that I did on McKay, is that a lot of people who, when they found out that he had converted to Catholicism, they were like, oh, that's just his latest scheme. I mean, he's not going to stick with that. And they were surprised that he did. And he also may have been surprised because I think he was looking for, a place that would really accept him. And he does say that as at the end, that he felt that he had gained acceptance, God's acceptance. So I don't know if that gets at your question or not, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Could I just piggyback on that a little bit, because I do think all of these writers, and I just know two of them really well from this panel, but I have to learn a lot more about the others. But it seems to me that these other ideological battles that kind of cause these kinds of tensions, somewhere in the novel or in the work, it seems to me that they get kind of dissolved for even a more greater cosmic personal battle. So, I mean, even the lieutenant in Power and the Glory, you've got this going all the way through. And then we know at the end of the novel that this is not about ideology. This is not about a political battle. This is a kind of a battle of the soul, right? Shūsaku Endō, you have Inoue, the Japanese magistrate, arguing this stuff out in silence. It kind of falls to the wayside, really, for this more cosmic battle. Step on the fume, step on the image, right? and you can go through a lot of. So I do think what modernity, they are modernists. They're looking at what are the tensions of politics, what's the tensions of social mores, how do they create this dialectical tensions? But there's always something that kind of gives. And as Cecilia was talking, I was thinking, well, that's right. It becomes a cosmic battle for my life and my soul, which is like, I'm done with that. I'm going on to this. And so I just think it's very interesting. It's part of this kind of, I think, trope in Catholicism and stories.
I think for Su Xuelin, what she finds in Catholicism is a kind of humanism, that she's grown up in a place that's very much concerned with national projects and especially anti-foreign positions. And you wonder, like, on what account, like, how is she going to justify to anyone back home, falling in with the foreigner's religion? And yet it seems to me, when she writes about her experience in France, the Catholicism taps into kind of a human experience that she sees missing in some of the more macro level discussions about the nation, that personhood has somehow fallen by the wayside, and Catholicism for her is a way of getting back in touch with the personhood and the affective elements of human existence. And that for her is something that the French as well as the Chinese share. Mm-hmm. So there's that transnational move, that she can't be an exclusive Chinese nationalist so long as she thinks that French Catholicism and Chinese Catholicism are tapping into to a shared humanity.
Yes, definitely that personalism that comes out of Lyon, that kind of French personalism, humanism, absolutely. It's kind of absorbed and breathed. A lot of people have breathed that in.
One thing that also came up in at least two of the talks, but really actually all of them is language of kenosis, but also a language of service. It seems that one question is, in what way do these writers think of the activity of writing as a kind of service of their respective cultures and service of, perhaps as we're seeing in some sense, kind of more transnational sense of humanity and Catholicism? How does the language of service speak to their goal as writers?
Well, I think the fact that Greene wrote The Lawless Roads as something that was born out of nonfiction and then later returned to that material for fiction, which is something that Greene did also in another way with The Quiet American when he was writing for the New Republic much later in his life. I think that speaks to an awareness that the element of story, which in The Lawless Roads is kind of like this mosaic style of writing where he's taking little scenes and different interactions in different places in Mexico, whereas The Power and the Glory is linear, it's narrative focused. There's a sense that he needed to tell this Catholic story, even though some in the Vatican weren't too fond of it, but they came around sooner or later. But the idea with Greene is that he wanted to bear a certain witness to this. And in the part that I had read from when he returned to England, he was very underwhelmed with English Catholicism, English faith in general, I would say. And, on one hand, the previous question about the clash of cultures, there is something, when you read Greene and you see him write about the indigenous faith in Mexico, it wavers from, is he kind of amplifying it and exaggerating it, trivializing it, or is he kind of holding it up because it is beautiful in his eyes? So I think there's some complexity going on there as well.
We have some questions now from our attendees. One thing that came up, of course, I think at least three of these writers are converts. And so, conversion is a feature of these figures. And so what way does this kind of, conversion is kind of a liminal space. I mean, to convert is a turning, in many ways to convert to Catholicism, to some extent you cross a threshold. And so how does that kind of conversion as a process speak to their task as writers and people writing in their kind of between cultural situations?
Well, Claude McKay, we might see him like looking at Catholicism for a long while. He was raised a Baptist, and from what I understand, he was pretty devout, and his family was very important to his family. He becomes an agnostic, and it's when he's over in Europe. He's in France. He observes the Catholicism there because he wants to see the churches and the art and everything, and so he goes. And he was very sexist. He thought that French, he liked the churches and everything, but he didn't like that Catholicism, because when he went into the churches, all he saw were women. But when he went to Spain, that changed his mind a little bit, because he said, I see men and women worshiping in the Spanish churches. And that made him, he argued that what he saw there was a Catholic way of life. And so all of these types of virtues that come with a Catholic family were on display for him. He could see that and appreciate that. And he talks about how later, when he is having these debates with people like Ellen Terry about religion, that starts to come back to him as he is thinking about, as he is doing his investigation, and he calls it his investigation of Catholicism, by reading a bunch of history and books and writers and philosophy. And it's over a process. It happens over the course of time. I think that the thing that actually helps him turn his corner, and I think it's called Right Turn to Catholicism, his big essay on all of this, I think it is because they cared for him when he really was almost dying. He was almost dying. I think in terms of service, I think he was really glad that he had something that he could give back. And he did go around. He went to all these different little places throughout the Midwest, giving talks and being nice to people and listening to them. And apparently that was very different for him, because he was not that sort of person for the majority of his life. So I just add that in.
I think all four of these artists are converts, and I think you're absolutely right to question, what is it about the conversion experience? This is your dramatic moment in some ways, both personal and social and cultural, and it becomes a kind of a place to think about the big questions of life, and what it means to be a human person, the tensions in that. So absolutely, I mean, certainly Greene is going to play out that constantly in his work. Endo as well, it's Endo's a convert, and almost everybody he has in his stories are converts, or they're displaced Catholics in a Japanese world, things like that. So I think it's very. I'm thinking. I know Mary Carr a little bit, who is a convert, and when she talks about lit, she says, my conversion gave me this like trajectory of a new way to think, and a new way to kind of create memoir and think about my life with different kinds of touchstones that I never would have thought before. So I think you're right. I think Catholicism allows that and gives a kind of a pathway. I mean, Augustine starts it with the Confessions, and in that moment you see the psychological development of the heart and the head, and that playing out.
I think the fact that we're talking about conversion, I mean, I'm happy that we are, because it is not something I think that is dug into enough. When Father Mark just mentioned, all four of these writers have conversion elements. You have mid-century Catholic intellectuals, people like even Marshall McLuhan, who was a convert. You have the, so-called cradle Catholics like DeLillo and Pynchon, who don't want anything really to do with Catholicism past, college. So you have this interesting mix where, if we're talking about the idea of between cultures and conversion as an act of that, I think there's something significant going on there. And, I think I mean, especially with McKay, as Stephen has been saying, you know, I think there's a poem of McKay's where he writes about when he's in Russia, and he describes like a cathedral pre-conversion, and then you read it, and then he rewrote it for the Catholic Worker for Day, and it's like completely a Catholic poem. I think it's a much better poem as a Catholic poem, you know, because you know he has a certain awareness of mystery, but it's cool to see. We can see that shift almost in real time in their literature. It's fun to see.
I wonder too, I mean, again, I don't want to keep it, I wonder too if Catholic conversion makes sense of people's suffering, their personal suffering, because I think all these writers, that suffering is such an important aspect, either getting through it, making sense of it, but seeing it as a kind of a holy endeavor, a pivotal endeavor in their life. And I just think that's, you know, the sorrowful mother. It's this idea of suffering as kind of a constituent part of the journey of the Catholic in life. Understanding suffering as a gift in some ways, in a weird paradoxical way to God.
I think for Su Xuelin, there's a sense in which her conversion brings about a kind of almost a re-embracing of her Chinese culture. She goes, for the first part of her life as a new culture thinker and writer, she's so interested in looking to all these Western forms of language and genre. After her experience of conversion in France, she then goes back and for the first time as a Chinese Catholic gets in touch with all these Chinese Catholics back in her hometown. And that's where she finds, she says, for the first time, this sense of belonging. So I think the experience of kind of alienation and then reintegration into the community is really key for her. And it certainly is an experience of suffering, as some of you have noted, that she always feels between, never quite at home. But nonetheless, she seems to think that faith and religion offer a chance for at least a partial community within a wider modern world of disassociated isolation, that you can find pockets in religion. Catholicism is for her the way that pocket of human experience and relationship might be found.
Given the kind of another question from our attendee, this clear, rich diversity of Catholic writing, really spanning the globe. In what sense, I guess, kind of a two-part question. In what way do these writers speak to the possibility of kind of a distinct Catholic literary theory, or what's a kind of a theme that can say, okay, this is how we can identify a Catholic literary text? But then conversely, also, how does their own specific cultural situation kind of broaden a kind of sense of what is Catholic literature?
I've been trying to think about that for a long time, Terrence, because I'm very interested in is there some kind of universal kind of component, or is there something that's given in this kind of Catholic imagination, especially to artists, and how is it then made particular and unique in their cultures? And I believe I go back to an old book by William Lynch called Christ and Apollo, of all things, that came out in 1960, a kind of a precursor to David Tracy talking about the analogical and dialectical imaginations and faith. But the drama of Christ as a kind of a concrete particular reality that enters into the world and yet can carry the weight of a universal kind of meaning. And so called the technology of the incarnation that Catholicism has, so that in its chapels and its Gothic cathedrals and its music and its novels and its poetry, it kind of allows in one particular concrete human experience a kind of a universal thing. And the more adequately it responds to that kind of dramatic arc of the life of Christ, the more adequately it speaks to the human experience. And so I do think that all of these people, these writers we're talking about, they were intellectuals. They were looking at the intellectual kind of river that Catholicism is. It's just you flow down this river if you want to. So I'm not sure if I'm answering it except to say that I think that there's something about that fact that the more that they can find a way to tell their story, to have their imagination meet that story of Christ and the drama of suffering and redemption, and the more I think it tends to say, oh, that's like this, like this, that's like this, like this. But it goes back to Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs, not his in the features of men's faces. And so this idea that there are 10,000 ways to play out the great stories, and I can do it as a Chinese person, as an African American, and so yeah, I do think that's how I'd love to hear what other panelists think about that. But that's what I keep on coming back to.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate. I mean, that's the question is what. Not to say we need to validate Catholic literary criticism, because we certainly don't, but there is a desire to have this kind of unified theory almost. And, I would say, just for Greene, I guess as like a test case, if you compare Power and the Glory, which is ostensibly a Catholic novel, overtly, it's just obviously about a priest who's on the run, and then you compare it with The Quiet American, which is not really a Catholic novel at all in an outward sense. But if you look at the dialogue of the characters, and I like to compare Fowler from The Quiet American with, to some extent, Mr. Tench in The Power and the Glory, but also The Whiskey Priest. If you look at the philosophical dialogue, there's a theological underpinning to it that's pretty significant. And I think Greene, was the right writer at the right time to do that, but he's certainly not the only one. And I think what as Father Mark kind of talks about, there's this sense of the incarnation, a sense of a total, the life of Christ is total in the world, and how these writers have that awareness. And it doesn't mean that they write about better people than or more moral people, but they write about it in a world where sin is a real thing, and they respect that in their work, I think.
Another question is, in what way do these writers give us resources as we live in in the kind of the global church now? This is no longer a church just on the kind of fringes of Europe, but throughout the world. And what way do these writers give us resources to be a global church, and also to deal with deep legacies of racism, colonialism? How do these writers kind of speak to both being global Catholics and Catholics struggling still to overcome racism and colonialism? I know that's a hard question.
Well, in general, it seems to me like the Catholicism in each of these figures is functioning as sort of a kind of minority discourse of some kind. Certainly colonialism could be one of them, racism. In Su Xuelin's case, I think it's nationalism is probably, the overarching narrative of what literature is supposed to be about and what literature is supposed to serve. And there's a way in which her Catholicism allows her to do something a little different with her literature, that she's not content to simply toe the line of the new culture movement. She's part of it. She's very enthusiastic about certain aspects of the project, but she's going to tweak some of the ingredients in what this new literature is supposed to do. And I think her kind of minority experience, if you will, either as a woman in a mostly male literature world, or as a Catholic in a almost entirely non-Catholic literature world, it gives her an avenue for saying something different, for having an identity from which to provide an alternative to the dominant framing narrative.
Yeah. Claude McKay, he wrote to Max Eastman before he was baptized, and he said that he had come to believe in the mystical body of Jesus Christ, and he said that in that mystical body, all people could enjoy what he called voluntary love. And he so I think Claude McKay was always looking for what would bring equality. He really wanted to see equality between the races. He wanted to be treated as good as anybody else. And he was disappointed in a lot of things. He was very disappointed in communism. He really thought that that was the answer. In his poem, If We Must Die, which is what he's most well known for, that was published in 1919 at the height of this terrible racial violence here in the United States, but was happening in other parts of the world too. And so that's seen as this call to justice, and that Black people are not going to continue to allow themselves to be degraded, and that they're willing to die if they have to. He published another poem in the Catholic Worker in 1945 called Look Within. And it's different. It's not the same as If We Must Die, but I think it recalls this idea of that we should be about the work of racial justice. And in that one, he essentially is making this observation about how we had committed ourselves to fight against fascism abroad, but we have it here in this country too. And he says, while 15 million Negroes on their knees pray for salvation from the fascist yoke of these United States, remove the beam, nearly 2,000 years since Jesus spoke, from your own eyes before the mote you deem, if proper, from your neighbors to extract. And so I think he really felt that that was something he could do as that he had a place where he could say this as a Catholic now. We still have this problem.
For sure.
We have time to sneak one last question in, maybe for a quick one. Ultimately, for these writers, Sue talks about the kind of the purpose of literature, and I guess maybe in very quickly, what do you think for these writers they would say the purpose of literature is?
I don't know if Endo would say anything about that. I know Greene would be allergic to it as well. That it doesn't have a purpose, and that, I think they would really go back to almost that aesthetic place. Maybe Stephanie, that's not true of Sue. She coming out of her story, and I don't know about Cecilia for him, but I don't know. I think they would say that it's not that writing and storytelling is just a powerful way to express the human experience, and that Catholicism gives you a lot more tools than you'd ever know in order to explore that and to engage it. That's what I think. I think that's what Endo found with Catholicism. I certainly think that's what Greene found. That's the only two I can speak of in this group.
I guess the question that raises for me then, if we're talking about Catholic literature, is it the Catholic part that makes possible this kind of expression of the human? Is it the Catholic part or the literature writing part? It sounds like you want to argue that both of those in tandem are somehow making available to people this uniquely rich kind of experience. Are you falling on one side or the other, or how would you put that?
Are you asking me or Terrence? You're asking Terrence, right? Please. No. You should end it because this. Yeah, please.
No, I'm just a humble philosopher. No literary theorist, but I think maybe perhaps writers can speak to the. This should bring warmth to the heart of Father Mark, but to the greater glory of God, in a way that is not limiting, and maybe in some sense, Father Mark's idea of a kind of purposeless purpose, that writing doesn't have to be bound by a specific purpose, and yet can redound both to what Cecilia talked about with an account of movement towards justice, but also movement towards deeper understanding of the human relationship with God. So it's a kind of purpose, but I think a deep and capacious one that can avoid the danger of propagandist or converting motivated literature.
I'd buy that.
And I would say, I think we have to understand her as sort of taking a middle position on this issue. I do think she, like the other new culture writers, sees literature itself as playing a function in society more than perhaps Greene or Endo would. Nonetheless, she's trying to maintain a space for the personal expressive human sensibilities and ordinary, non-political, non-ideological elements of human experience, perhaps over and against some of the writers like Lu Xun who wanted to instrumentalize, if you will, literature much more. So she's trying to pull back, I'd say, from that tendency.
Well, I have to do my due diligence and close it there. But I really want to express my gratitude to everyone who's attended tonight, to all our co-sponsors, to these writers that we've been thinking with. The writing is a gift, and I appreciate receiving it from whomever I may gather it. And thank you, of course, also to our panelists. I also want to note, I'll kind of dump this in the chat box to all our attendees, that one of the things we're going to be doing this year is kind of continuing some of this theme of writing between cultures. And so we'll be having a paid seminar with some excellent scholars on Endo, looking at his novel, The Samurai, and his search for Christ in Japan and beyond. So the information in the chat box. We'll also be sending it to you as an email. And again, thank you to all. I think the great message of tonight is that the church and literature can be for the whole world. And our task is to keep on writing and keep on reading. So thank you, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.